Hello, and welcome back to What Now on the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. And I'm here in the studio with my friends and colleagues.
David Kennedy.
And Red Keating.
And I'm Julie Brown. And today we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Christopher Kerr. Welcome, Chris.
Oh, thank you for having me.
We're so excited to jump in and talk about your fascinating work and research you've been doing in Buffalo. And so I'm going to say a little bit about your bio and then we'll jump right in. Christopher Kerr is the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Executive Officer at Hospice, Palliative Care Buffalo. Born and raised in Toronto, Canada, he earned his MD as well as a PhD in neurobiology. Outside of direct patient care, his focus is the area of patient advocacy. He has a passion for palliative care and a belief that such care should be throughout the continuum of illness. To date, the research team at Hospice Buffalo has published multiple studies on this topic and documented over 1,500 end-of-life experiences, many of which are videotaped. This work was the subject of his TEDx Buffalo talk, which is awesome to watch, and has been viewed 5.3 million times. It has been the subject of numerous reports around the world, as well as the BBC, New York Times, Washington Post, Atlantic Monthly, Scientific America, and the Huffington Post. Oh, New York Times and Psychology Today. It's also featured in a recent docuseries on Netflix called Surviving Death and a PBS documentary called Death is But a Dream. His work has also been published in a book, Death is But a Dream, by Penguin Random House, which was released in 2020 in over 10 languages. He lives on a horse farm in East Aurora, New York. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, and I guess for me, I'm wondering, how does this wonderful guy born in Toronto shuffle off to Buffalo? And are you still a Leafs fan or a Sabres fan?
Well, first of all, I'm proudly Canadian, and I'm here in Buffalo specifically because I'm close to the border. What happened was my father died when I was a boy, and there was a surgeon who would take me under his wing. And I worked with him as an orderly at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, and he was recruited to Ohio, and he asked me to come down and finish off my undergrad, and I wouldn't have costs because I could live at his home. That's how it started, was just coming down for a year, met a woman, and that's how I got, but still Canadian. But I moved to Buffalo to get close, from Ohio to get closer to the Canadian border. So,
wow.
I can see Canada.
And this work, tell us a little bit about how you got into the palliative side and this dying side, and what aspects of that drew you?
I wish I could tell you it was some noble aspiration or idea, but it was actually quite the opposite. But you wonder about fate. So if anything, I probably had an aversion towards all things dying. You know, I had lost, as I said, I lost my father when I was a boy. In medical school and in training, I was really fascinated and kind of enamored with acute medicine, interventional medicine, and you're on that steep learning curve. And I actually petitioned to get out of my hospice and palliative care rotation as a resident. And so I came to Buffalo, and I'm a fellow. I had done internal medicine, was a fellow in cardiology, and I needed to moonlight. I saw an ad in the newspaper for a hospice doctor on the weekends, and it was flexible. So I came here really just to support my family. And it was almost surreal going from a cath lab to the bedside of a dying patient. And I was could not have been more unprepared, just to be a comforter, to be present. But I was here for a very brief period of time, like a matter of weeks, and I realized this was the most meaningful role I had ever played as a physician. And the privilege of having time to get to know patients as people and their families. It's unbelievable to look back, but when I was a resident, when somebody was dying, and we said the words, "There's nothing more we can do for them," which really meant there's nothing more we can do to them, we would sign off. we abandoned the patient. So here I am in this opposite role. So I went back to my, this is a true story. I went back to my chairman and I said, I this is what I want to do. And he assumed I was going through some crisis and asked me to first speak to a psychiatrist.
Wow.
Because why would you, that's what you do, if you want to go hold somebody's hand and do that at the end of your career when you're retired. So I say that because it speaks to how far we've come as a society and a culture and recognizing the value of what we do for these patients. So yeah, I did that and never looked back. I've been here 25 years.
Wow. So what, you're talking about, Julie, in the introduction, that sense of what's the end of life experience. And I think in those terms for our purposes here, you talk about the dreams and visions of the dying.
And both of those are really inaccurate nomenclature, to be honest with you. It's the only closest reference point we had. So basically what happened was I was here very early, and it was my non-physician colleagues in nursing, social work, and pastoral care, and the volunteers, quite frankly, who were making me more attuned to the fact that there's the dying I observed in kind of a medical model, which is the physical symptology, the organ failure, all of that. But there was the other side of it, which the subjective side. What was the patient experiencing? What was their existence? And that what I saw wasn't what they were experiencing, and that there was something more rich and meaningful. And so the end of life dreams and vision reference is really a reference to the inner experiences, the subjective state that the dying patient experiences, which often includes these very intense, often they occur within a dream framework. But why I kind of bristle at the nomenclature is that when we do our studies and ask them to click off information about the dreams, they're very adamant. No, I don't normally dream. No, this wasn't, weird metaphorical stuff. This was a happening, a memory, a lived event. So the names kind of are hard, but end of life experiences or dreams or visions. But that's how this started. And the research came out of pure frustration because I was trying to teach this to young doctors. There are these other things that they needed to have at least regard for and never dismiss, and they would say, well, there's no evidence for it. So that's why we did the research.
You tell a story in your book, and I think your TED Talk as well, about one of your first introductions to it when you'd started your moonlighting job and a nurse referred to you, this patient will be dying soon, because she knew that based on what the patient was reporting. Yeah,
it's funny. She's a crusty old hardcore nurse that I have lashes on my back from, but she was extraordinary. What had happened was he was a relatively young man. He was in his 40s. His name was Tom. And I was pretty hardened by, those were the HIV days. And it was hard to watch. He's a young man. He didn't have anybody, like so many men of those time. Their family had abandoned them, whatever. And I thought he had more time, and I was still in my traditional doctor role. So, well, if we can give him IV fluids and antibiotics, we can buy him some time. And she didn't even look up and said, no, he's dying. And I said, why? She said, because he's seen his deceased mother. And what I learned very quickly was that the people who were looking at the patient in totality, who were more present at the bedside, had learned to appreciate that there was actually prognostic significance to these events. And they were using them to gauge where somebody was at. What ended up happening was, I really didn't believe it. And ironically, I had seen this myself as a child with my father, and so I was kind of gone full circle. That's why I said it was almost kind of fatey that this came back. When we did our original study, what we did is we asked patients every day before death what their experiences were. And what was interesting was that Nancy was right. It was highly predictive. So that what we would do is we had a standardized questionnaire. We'd approach each patient as they were entering the last few weeks of life. They were screened for delirium or confusional states. We looked at medications, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's a university-approved study, so they had to sign consents, witnessed, filmed, the whole thing. What we found was, as patients were approaching death, there was a dramatic increase in frequency of these events. So they were predictive. But more importantly, or as importantly, the content shifted. So as they got closer to dying, you're more likely to see people who you've loved and lost. And when we ask people to rate comfort on a kind of menu list of content, seeing the deceased was associated with the greatest comfort. So there's this built-in mechanism as you approach death where you're more likely to be reconnected with people who you loved, and that brought you the greatest comfort. So Nancy was right.
Another theme that I know that we've heard about and that you address in your book is it's also that sense of travel, that the person is preparing for a trip.
Yeah, I think it's over a third. So I've seen every mode of travel. I've seen canoes, airplanes, kites, everything. And oftentimes there's even more metaphor to, so they'll see a canyon and they're looking to the other side, a river that they've got to cross, a boat that they got to get in. And what's so interesting to me is rarely has anyone ever made the connection to what is. Sometimes it's not them that's traveling. I've had patients, for example, who've seen their childhood home and it's moving closer to them, but they often don't make the association between what seems pretty obvious. But
it's interesting. If I could just share a little story, I had this recollection. We also, when we interviewed Patricia Pearson and her work around this idea of travel, and about 6 days before my dad died, he started repeating many times that night, "Hey, Julie, let's get the hell out of Dodge. Come on, let's get the hell out of Dodge." And he had just gone. He had had brain surgery and he'd gone through delirium, and I heard that as just more of it. But then in the reviewing and stepping back, realizing that was also the day that we had made the decision to stop all treatment. He was going to come back to Peterborough, to palliative care, and he had become very peaceful. He had come out of the delirium, and that night he repeatedly said, "Let's get the hell out of Dodge," over and over and over again.
Well, we published a study where we did a qualitative analysis on the thematics, and you actually hit an important point. If it's not travel, it's the notion of preparing to go. Some kind of preparation or ambition to get somewhere, like you're stating. Yeah, very interesting.
And I mentioned to you before we came on, Chris, how much I appreciated reading the book because it validated for me and affirmed those years. And yet I must admit that there's hesitation in saying this to other people because and patients feel that all the time. Like, I don't dare tell people what I'm experiencing because, they think I'm just making this up or I'm disbelieving it. But if you find an empathetic ear, they will open up. But then, as somebody who's there listening to this, I have found myself over the years, saying to people, "Hey, did you hear about this? Is what I experienced through this." But then I found a hesitation to say that because of the reactions. So, and then I read where you say, 90%, up to 90% of people experience this in their last days of life. So that was very affirming to me.
Yeah, a couple of things that really. So yeah, our incident rate was basically 90%. It was probably going to be higher, but people would rule out of our study for delirium, for example. And our incident rate's about probably 15-20% higher than most people report, and that makes sense because we asked every day. But it's such a good point that you bring up. So the argument goes something like this. So dying itself is lonely. What they're experiencing is unshared. And probably the worst thing we couldn't do is make people feel more isolated by either medicalizing these experiences or dismissing them. There's some data that people are reluctant to disclose for fear of ridicule. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's great to hear you speak because people who've done this work know this stuff in their bones, that it can be a difficult subject to either validate or invalidate or relay for that reason. And there's such a tendency to medicalize it, right? Mm-hmm. That this is a delirium or whatever. Mm-hmm.
Well, I can tell you 30 years ago when I was working in palliative care here in Peterborough, it was prognostic. We would
Yeah.
we would have conversations, and the train is coming. I need a ticket, and we would just know.
Yeah.
And so I just echo David reading your book. It went, oh, fine. Yeah, and then you kind of go, finally somebody with some credibility. Finally somebody that has the ability to have the research behind them to say this really does happen.
Well, it's really, part of it is the messenger. This is a whole other topic. It's important that it was a doctor, unfortunately.
Yes.
Because, well, one, they're probably the most skeptical, but doctors are scared to validate anything that might be spiritual, or that they can't objectify, measure, image, and for all the above. But yeah, I feel a little guilty because it's something that all of you have had. If you've spent any time at the bedside, really connected at the bedside, you know this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Chris, I'm wondering if you could just speak to, in your book, you talk about just getting the ethical approval to do this kind of research, and yet what you referenced was that patients were very keen and appreciative of this opportunity to have these conversations. Is that correct?
Oh, I'm so glad nobody ever asked me that. Thank you for asking. So yeah, it's kind of, there's two stories in this. One is that the approval process, I was originally denied, and it speaks to our tendency to try to sterilize the dying. Mm-hmm. And the whole idea was you can't interfere. Let them sleep. Don't bother them. That's intrusive, unethical. So I went back there and I just basically argued, and I said, I appealed it, and I said, have any of you actually taken care of these people? Because it's lonely. They're looking up at a ceiling, and they actually want to connect. And probably and I write about this at the end of the book, one of the most interesting things about doing this work was that we had a projection of how many people would say yes to participating, and we thought even less people would agree to be filming. And the most beautiful part is that almost without exception, people were more than happy to participate. And many of them were filmed, a lot of them were filmed, disfigured, lessened, really compromised. And what it tells you is a few things, and this is just a wonderful story, that there's no secondary gain. They're not going to benefit. They're not going to see the outcome. They're not going to be acknowledged and aware, but that they wanted to contribute, and they wanted their words to matter. They wanted to have meaning, they wanted to connect, and they wanted to be heard. And it's this idea that there's a role, you can't do enough to humanize our care of the dying patient. And that's what this said, right? Is they're happy to, they want, they don't want to be, and yeah, I'm sure you guys have seen, I've seen some of the most comfortable dying experiences when, if they're a kitchen family, I call them, and they're having a party in the room. That's actually what puts them back together and allows them to relax. So that's exactly right. That's what happened.
I love the idea that, one of the things that I used to start with people was, you're the expert, not me. I've never done what you've done. You're tell me what this is like for you, because you're the expert. And often we see ourselves as, we're the ones trained, we're going in. But to remember that the person who's dying is the one who's the expert in this. They know what's going on. And our job is to listen to that and learn from that.
Yeah. And dying is really not organ failure, it's life closure, and it's their life that's closing. So their perspective is the only one that matters in the end. Yeah.
You talk about that idea of moving, of learning to detach, and that attachment piece to the things that have been their world, have been their life, and the need to detach from that and finding an attachment to where they're going in that process. Am I correct in interpreting how you've put that?
Yeah. I hadn't thought of it that way, but yes, that's fair. I think of it as more, I guess there's attachment within this, but what they're really doing is reconnecting themselves and putting themselves back together, which is usually based on their most substantive, meaningful, loving relationships. And I guess to do that, they are detaching from things that are less relevant in the end. I'm always fascinated by what it boils down to, and that there's an editing process, so they tend not to recall or relive relationships that were problematic or conditional. So it's one parent, not another, one sibling, not another, and it's the people who loved them purely or forgave them wholly that they feel again, that become proximate to them. And I think that's what puts them together.
So many great quotes I'd love to read from your book, but just a short one was, you said it's a universal phenomena and it is always about love.
Yeah. That's in the end. And it's so interesting because they're so, and I'm not the first one, we're not the first to ever acknowledge, but there's so little religious iconery or reference, unless you say, well, it's about the tenets of faith, which are love and forgiveness. And it's love's the absolutely overarching theme to all of this. Whether it's your pet, whether it's your child you lost, your parent, that's what seems to define us.
Love and the other thing that I was getting out of it was that sense of transformation, that these experiences are transformational. What happens if the dream or the vision or the experience isn't so positive?
Well, that was a huge learning piece for us. So when we started doing the research, we had a survey and it said, was the dream comforting, discomforting, or neither? And I forget it's like 13% were discomforting. But those were actually, what we got wrong was discomforting to us was a feeling, and we thought it was probably without meaning, right? And the discomforting ones are the most transformative. And it comes down to this. So, all of us have been harmed, hurt for having lived, whether it's loss, regret, what have you, be harmed. And you live as you die. You die as you live. And those things, dying doesn't whitewash the life that was led. And what we learned was that people who had these pivotal injuries often revisited them, but in a way that put them back together. Whether it's the veteran who had survivor's guilt and sees his war buddies. We have remarkable footage of a man who had been drug addicted and harmed his family and is tormented in his end-of-life experiences, thinking he's being stabbed where his cancer was by all the people he harmed. And then he asked to because of these experiences, he asked to reconnect with the child he was estranged from, only to tell her how much he loved her and how sorry he was. And then he slept after that. So a lot of the so-called negative or discomforting dreams led to reckoning or finding peace. So it's very interesting. And stunning is that they could be carrying these burdens for 60 years. And all the talk therapy, drug therapy, whatever, wouldn't have done shit. And then the answer was in them, of them. And there's this kind of final justice that it gets resolution.
Right.
And that reminds me of a wonderful quote, again, that in your book, where you say, dying is a process from which it is not necessary to excavate meaning if patients themselves do not make it available. There's no need to look for answers, mostly because of what happens at life's end does not involve a question. It is itself the answer, a self-sustaining, inspiring, meaningful answer that requires neither intervention nor conjecture, just presence.
Yeah,
and I love that. I love that.
Thank you. I think it's so important, and it's so distinct from what people talk about end-of-life experiences, near-death experiences, where they're kind of structurally changed and they got an assignment to go back into life and do stuff. These people, it's not a trial run, they're actually dying. And it would be cruel to think that they had to decipher something, like that there was work to do. And I can honestly say, I don't know if I've ever had a patient say to me, I had this experience, help me understand the metaphor. If, you lost a parent when you were 5 years old and you're 90 and they come to you, that's your meaning and that's your feeling and it's only yours. But I love the idea that they're not asking for translation. It's baked in. And the other thing that I just think is fascinating is so much gets written about these great reveals in the dying process, huge pronouncements, understandings, and
the Hollywood endings.
Famous words. It really was. It's sitting at the kitchen table, and we got a great woman, for example, who talks about this. She's sitting at the kitchen table, and there's her deceased daughter and her deceased husband, and that's who she is. And that's all. And the other thing that's absolutely fascinating is one of the strong themes is so little is said between the dreamer and the person in the dream. In other words, it's intuited, it's understood, and they're feeling. They don't need words to feel their love. I'm always struck by that. No, they didn't say anything. And sometimes people are amazed. They just waved, that kind of thing.
Yeah, or I've heard oh no, they're just there.
Yeah.
They're just there. They're just sitting in the corner, or they're just there. And how is that for you? It feels good.
So you picked off now two of the things that came out as themes in our qualitative study. And that was the other one, is just a comforting presence. So preparing to go was the other one you nailed, and the other one was a comforting presence. They're just there. And how it's, as you've all seen this, you'll be talking to the person and they'll be referencing or talking to or pointing at that other person in the room.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think that it's important to say it's comfort in a way that we may never have felt before in its totality. Yeah, I got that from that. It's an incredible love, and it's not attached to anything. It's pure.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what I'm trying to say, but you said it better. There's clearly selection bias in that what they're feeling doesn't come with conditions or explanations. Like the people that they love, and I think this is one of the reasons why animals are so prevalent, is that's often equally unconditional, right? You don't need a translator. That's my dog from my childhood. That's all.
Chris, is there a particular, there's so many great examples and stories you tell of these folks in your books, but is there one or two that stay with you? Is there a story that for you just really impacted you, or was a huge teaching moment for you as an individual?
Yeah, but I appreciate the question. So I'm not trained to take care of children. I was trained in internal medicine, but long story short, we have a large pediatric program, and there were so many symptom issues with children, I inadvertently got pulled into kind of consulting almost on how to manage various symptoms. And as I got more and more involved in this, it ended up being a big part of my life for about a decade. I was petrified. I didn't go into pediatrics for good reason. And I was very scared with children and not knowing how to have create some awareness of what was happening to them, right? As they gained losses of function or whatever. And I just didn't know. And what ended up happening was, and there's a lot of footage of these kids, and they're in the book, is that they ended up essentially telling me. And what happened was that they were being informed all along, largely from these experiences, that even though they did not necessarily understand finality or mortality, and oftentimes it was the return of an animal that they had known that had passed, whether it was theirs or a neighbor's or a grandparent's, and they were seeing them in life, and that implication was clear. And many of them used the same language, that they weren't going to be alone. And then whatever fear they seemed to have was addressed in some way. So in one case, it's, how does this person B exist, go on without a parent? And then they see their mother's best friend who had passed in their mother's room. Another young lady created a castle that her bed was in. And when asked about why the castle, she said it was a safe place. And she described a light with warm sun coming through, and she could feel the warmth, actually feel it. So I guess the takeaway for me was that there was this built-in innate ability within this process of dying for even children to find some form of grace. And that it didn't require my intrusion. I didn't have to role play. I didn't have to look for words. I just literally they told me. So I would go in, the first time was striking because I was very close to this young lady named Jessica. And I'm going in scared to death. But what do I say? Because I'm also balancing a mother who's openly distraught. So all of her cues around her have changed, and not knowing how to be anything to her of value. And then she tells me. And in the end, it was almost as though she cared for the process herself, and she was 13 years old. Yeah, that'll never leave.
I've had parents tell me a similar story about how their child that passed on kind of took care of them and took care of that process. Found a comfort in caring for others through it.
That's actually, we were in the New York Times, I think 2 months ago, and they covered one of the experiences. And the reporter went into the home and they had lost their child. And they described that process where clearly this little boy was saying things that were meant as gestures of care and concern to his stunned and broken parents. In the one case of the little girl who was seeing her mother's friend, she started to see herself identifying with this deceased woman, and because her mother always described her as heroic and strong, and she thought that by seeing her, that also meant she had those same attributes. What was fascinating was it only came out when I was talking to her and asking next questions, and we're actually on film, because she had kept it to herself because she was trying to protect her mother. So imagine that. You're having this whole inner world, you're trying to make sense of something that makes no sense. Be it she knew it was beautiful, but she didn't want to hurt anyone. So
I often think, I always talk about follow what would a child do,
Yeah, right.
Because their innocence makes them pure. And so then therefore their experiences and how they express their experiences are generally bang on. Because they don't get tangled up in all the anxieties of being an adult.
Well, the other thing is they do a much better job of not editing things they're experiencing. So, and they can swing between the imaginary and the real. There's a reason why Disney puts animals that talk, and in our studies we published the case series on the kids. So many of them, their animals, whether they're toys or pets, play these larger roles because they're just life, right? They don't say, "Oh, it's just a dog." So yeah, they're more creative and less edited.
Chris, in Canada, we have sort of adopted and have legalized medical assistance in dying.
Yeah.
Does that exist in Buffalo and New York?
No.
Okay.
No, it's a huge battle here. There's been some recent changes. Medical societies just endorsed it, like within the last month, which was a surprise. But we're a mile away from it being legalized.
Right.
It's such a different feeling because when I talk to all my Canadian friends, I'm hearing, "Oh yeah, their parent died through this program." I'm like, "Wow, yeah."
Because before we came on, the three of us were talking, and we wondered, what is the end of life experience like for somebody who knows they're going to die, but it's through a process of medical assistance? And does that truncate this experience somehow?
I'll be honest with you, and this isn't meant as an opinion or an editorial on medical assisted dying, but there are a couple of observations, I guess. Is there's important living to do within the dying process. That's obviously compromised if your quality of life includes malignant pain that doesn't allow for you to, even think straight. But there's important living. We did a study, which I think is the most interesting one. What we were keenly aware of was that dying isn't this passive process, right? That people are gaining remarkable insights, that something is happening at a psychic or spiritual level that matters. There were learnings that were taking place right up into the last days of life. And so what we did is we used an instrument that measures post-traumatic stress. So the idea within a negative, challenging experience like dying, there might be positive psychologic gains or attributes. And what we found is that people who were having these experiences compared to people who weren't were actually significantly, measurably gaining understanding, adapting, learning right up until the last days of life. And going back to this idea that there's things that happen during this time that seem to really matter. It's not just defined by physical decay. And so you wonder a couple of things. One is we need to be awfully careful when we pharmacologically interfere, because you can sterilize somebody from their own dying process. So they have to be used appropriately. And the other is you wonder if you bring on a death, whether you've extinguished some of that. We've had a lot of patients, for example, who are having intense end-of-life experiences, but they're disrupting their sleep. And so they'll say, I'm sorry, but I can't sleep anymore. This has to go away. So we'll give them a medication. And the next day they'll say, I missed those experiences. So yeah, I don't know. I'm mixed, very mixed.
Well, it's a new way of dying, right?
Yeah.
And it seems that, your studies exist because people are dying not by a medical assistants that are having these experiences, right?
Yes.
And so what happens when, and like you said, there's the possibility that maybe some of these things get missed.
Yeah. And, then there's the question of acute death.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Though, you hear things like my life flashed before my eyes. Mm-hmm. Or when George Floyd was having his air squeezed out of him by the police, he's calling for his mother, or the battlefield cries for a parent. You wonder.
Chris, how has doing this work and this research changed you?
Oh, question I find the hardest. We were very, 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 very disciplined on looking at this phenomena as a pre-death thing without extrapolating to afterlife, religion, or paranormal. Because we wanted it to be clinically validated without the interpretation. I think where I end up is that after doing this for so many years, is that you can't help thinking there's a better story. And the first chapter, I think, for me in that story is that the people that the love that you've experienced, the people that you've loved is actually always proximate to you. It's there for you. I think one of the big takeaways for me is to see somebody in their late 9th decade of life, and they lost a parent again early, and they can hear their mother's voice, smell the perfume, all those sorts of things that meant that they were never gone for them, that they were always there. Maybe it needed to be revealed or rekindled in memory, but that it was there. So I think it changes that for me. when I think about my own death, I certainly don't fear the process of dying like I think I would if I hadn't had these experiences. And we see people who come in, particularly if they're older and they've seen a ton of this, they're almost looking forward to what they experience when their eyes close. It's really quite remarkable. So I guess that's where I kind of end up.
In following that up, I think one of the great challenges that all of us in this work face is that, death still is one of those topics that nobody wants to deal with or face or talk about. And so I think it's gotten a lot better in the last few years. But I love the line, you say, and I forget where it is in the book, but you say, instead of looking away from death, we need to look toward it. Not that that's morbidity. I mean, people always think, oh, how can you do this work? Isn't it morbid? Isn't it hard? And convincing them that looking at death actually helps us live better and clarify life. But it's that initial fear where people don't even want to talk about death and look away from it. And so that when they are dying, it's kind of like all this crisis moment of things that I've never wanted to look at before that maybe, I don't have a choice in now, I'm forced to. But it seems to me that one of the things we could, and why we're doing this podcast, and particularly with you, is to help people say it's not a bad thing to talk about this and to think about death and look at it rather than looking away and pretend it's not going to happen to us.
Yeah, I think medicine has made this worse, right? Is that there was a time where death was a far more normalized and accepted aspect of life, where it was visible, it was in the community, it was shared. And what happened is we institutionalized it in hospitals. As science has outstripped the art of medicine, we've given the illusion that there's always something you can do.
Yeah.
But you can't even die of old age now. You've got to have 7 diagnoses.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
medicine has tried to defy death to the extent that we've created this illusion that there's always something you can do. So to your point, when it actually becomes a reality, it becomes acute. So, I mean, the most remarkable thing of our lives here at Hospice is that obviously patients are so absolutely unaware of their own dying when they've lost 100 pounds and can't eat and walk. But they've had an army of experts behind them waiting for the next test. You know the drill. And then as a society, there's a consumer sense that there's always something you can do about it, and we're absolutely ageist. You're not allowed to grow old. So you add all those variables together. But I think what's changed is the change isn't happening within medicine, it's outside of medicine. And your podcast is an example of people who they don't want the generation before's dying process. They don't want the doctor's death. They want a humanized, honorable, dignified death in which they have a say, and trying to demystify it and humanize it. And that's exactly what this effort you're doing today is. So the voices of reason, and my point is, aren't coming from the physician world. It's coming from the people who are actually going to experience this in a way. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I also realize, and we've all talked about this too, that physicians who do work in this field, I think what I have come to appreciate is that their humanity is out front. The medical piece is absolutely crucial, but they don't lead with that. They lead with their humanity. And as you do, I mean, it's pretty obvious to pick that up from you, and how that allows us to connect with people during that dying piece, because it's something in common with all of us, and that each of us may have a piece to share, but we begin by leading with our humanity.
Yeah. And you said something, which is that you implied that people don't really understand what it's like for us to do this work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a great story, and it's what I'd like to write about one day, which is that you would think from the outside that we are depressed or depressing for having done this work. And the reality is that we're a very enlightened and privileged and uplifted. And it's because we see the very best of humanity.
Yes.
We see unbelievable love, unbelievable sacrifice. The caregiver piece of this is what people are capable of even when they don't know they can do it. Their lives stop and they become parental to their children, to their parents. I mean, the sacrifice and the strength they find,
The
expressions.
courage.
Yeah, you know. And so you walk out of that, and it's like going to the church for humanity. It's uplifting, and you feel privileged to even to bear witness. And so it turns out we're not depressed after all.
You're absolutely right.
And you want to know what's interesting? We're doing a study. It's just finishing. It's fascinating. So if you type up books on caregiving and you found out you were going to be a caregiver, you'd go to the tallest building and jump, because the titles make it sound like your life's going to end. Work-life balance, yeah. So anyways, but what we did was we knew in our bones that there was more to caregiving, that basically it was the hardest, best thing people had ever done, right?
Yeah.
And so we did a study using measures of caregiving, and wouldn't you know it, the harder the lift, like for these parents of children or people without means, the greater the gratitude.
Yep.
Yeah.
So there's value in hard things.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great story.
And it is. It's the gift of caregiving that we know that person can never give back to us afterward. Like, I mean, it's given in true love. We do this out of altruistic experiences, not expecting back.
No, and that speaks to the best of us, right? And
it does.
So yeah, it's a really interesting study.
Yeah.
As we start to wind up our time today, Chris, is there anything we haven't asked or spoken to that feels really important about your work, your research?
I think the only thing is that, we die in the context of our lives. So that means that how people die, how they leave us, matters a lot to our loved ones. And that you can see dying as something empty and defined by the physical dimensionality of it all, or you can see dying as something rich in love and meaning. So to that end, we've done a lot of work and published several studies on what these dreams and visions do, witnessing them do for the bereaved.
Okay.
And it turns out what's good for the patient is good for their loved ones. And when we do studies of bereavement processing, grief processing, if they've witnessed these sorts of things, they actually measurably, significantly process differently for having watched this. And we have a lot of those folks on film, and they're actually as moving, if not more moving sometimes, than the patients themselves, because it turns out they remember differently. They have reverence. It recontextualized loss. So it matters in not just for the patient, but for their loved ones as well.
Oh, that so validates and emphasizes the importance of these conversations then. And for those of us who get to do this work, of where possible to include
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the unit of care is never just the patient, but those in their lives. Well, you did it today. You have hung on to the statements that your father was making. That's how you recall. Yeah.
And once I could make the meaning of that statement, it does feel very meaningful to me, to your point. It does feel very meaningful.
When we looked at our loved one in the bed, beyond knowing they're physically comfortable, our next question is, where are they and how are they? And when they express these sorts of things, that's what we get from it.
Yeah. Lovely.
I was going to say, I think that also our work can be to encourage family, not to turn away from those experiences, but to listen to them and find that comfort and encourage them not to see these as pathological and something that needs to be treated, and not to be afraid of.
Yeah, I mean, that's ultimately our job, right? Which is among our jobs is to narrow the distance at the bedside between the person in the bed and those who love them. Yeah. And the last point on that, which is this is not the domain of medicine.
No.
Everybody has that obligation, from pastor to volunteer to social worker to nurse. It's a human experience. It's not about the parts, and it's not up to the doctor. It's really, really important that everybody go into this with that role. Yeah.
And before we go, I just, Mr. Summary Man here, I just love the message of love and transformation, but I also love the fact that your book is full of mystery. And that the mystery at the end of life is important, and it has value. And your research and your work has sort of given voice to that and given it credibility. And as we were talking, I was thinking here, your work has encapsulated the title of our podcast, I think, very well, because the word threshold is in our title for a reason. Yeah. And we've thought about that for a really, really long time and talked back and forth. But that threshold between being here and not being here, and maybe being somewhere else, is what your research is all about. And so we start off with what now? What now that I've got this diagnosis? And then we work our way through to that place where there's a threshold between life and death.
That's so smart. But it's so funny because we're a society that has to know and define everything. Yeah. There's no room for not knowing and just having reverence for it, right? And that's where you get to with this, because we actually just don't know, but we know it happens. We don't have to understand where and how, but just have to have reverence for it, I think, is where you end up. Yeah. Thank you.
It's been a delight. Thanks, Chris.
You guys are great. You know what you're talking about.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough, dedicated to providing compassionate care and support to individuals and families facing life-limiting illness and loss. What Now is recorded at Thin Spaces Studio in Peterborough, Ontario. Special thanks to Paradise Garage for providing the music. Technical support is by Sean Heichard, and audio engineering by Kevin Fleming. More episodes of What Now are available for free on most major podcast platforms. If you found value in our conversations, please support us by following the show, leaving a 5-star review, and sharing with your friends and loved ones. If you'd like to support the essential work of Hospice Peterborough, please consider visiting hospicepeterborough.org/donate. Your contribution helps us continue to provide vital care and support. Until next time, may you find peace and comfort on your journey.